Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to see so many people joining us today. It's Monday, but well, I see so much motivation. And I hope we're going to have an interesting discussion today. And I'm also looking forward to see you at the workshops after that.
Yeah.
All right. So today we're going to talk about intercultural competencies and specifically a little bit about the background and why it is important for us to have intercultural competencies when we come to a different culture. What we want to discuss today, well, first of all, I want to give you a little bit of information about culture and its components that probably some of you are already familiar with that, but this is very important for us to know beforehand. Then we will talk about individual and cultural identification and what does it mean for us and how it reflects on our behavior in everyday life. Then I will walk you through the difference between the stereotypes, prejudice, and when stereotypes and prejudice can or cannot lead to discrimination. Then we're going to look into some of the models on inclusion and cultural sensitivity, how that reflects and how it develops in different contexts. And eventually, we look into the components of resilience in cross-cultural context. And because we know that coming to a different cultural context is actually a very stressful event. So besides when we are just going for our own businesses, let's say to a different culture, whether it is a tourism or visiting relatives, or maybe going on to do education or to take up some employment. So besides the everyday stress that we encounter, there is a cultural stress that comes with it. And we will look into how to build resilience in this content. So a little bit about myself. I hold 2 master's degrees, one of them in psychology and the other one, it's more precise, it's in psychology of diversity, migration and inclusion. And I had privileged to study in different cultures for that matter, and also to get to know a little bit some cultures like Poland and Turkey and Ireland. I'm doing at the moment my PhD in Ireland, and before that I've been lecturer and training facilitator for over 10 years, and I worked in educational establishments, in some international organizations, in Belarus, in Germany, in France, and I had a really good experience being an expert for the Council of Europe. That is, as you probably know, specifically work with values on human rights and intercultural competencies and how to prevent discrimination on different grounds. All right, so our aims for today. First of all, we will understand the impact on culture on identity. Second, we will look into how to develop cultural sensitivity and ways to overcome prejudice. Then we will look into how to build cultural competencies, specifically cultural self-awareness, non-judgmental attitude, and awareness of different values, and also try to identify our individual pillars of successful cultural transition. Okay, now please look at the slide. Let's think for a moment, what is culture? So what we know now in psychology and in cultural studies, that culture is a very difficult subject. And if you try to look into different definitions of what culture is, you might come across to very different opinions and very different sometimes points of view, and that actually talks mostly about how complex culture is. But I want to provide you with 2 definitions from the Cambridge Dictionary. So on one hand, culture is identified or defined as the music, art, theater, and literature. And on the other hand, when we talk about culture, we talk about ways of life, especially in general, especially the general customs and beliefs of a particular group of people at a particular time. So from these 2 definitions, and they're both correct, we can assume that culture is something that represented with so-called big C, sometimes how we refer to that. And this is what we can see when we arrive in a new culture, in a new country, or in a new town. We see different architecture, we see different art, we see different folklore music, literature, etc. On the other hand, there is something that we refer to as a small c, and this is what we don't see initially, but we come across to that when we interact with people from different cultures, and then we get exposed to different beliefs, different assumptions, different traditions, different attitudes to particular issues of a particular group in a particular time. Right, so what you can see here is precisely what I've just mentioned. So when we think about culture, we can sometimes think about an iceberg in the ocean, for example, and the big sea or big culture that is usually represented in language, foods, holidays, folklore, arts, way how people dress. We can see it. This is a very small visible level of culture of iceberg, and the small c, these cultural beliefs and behaviors, values, personal space and manners, and for example ideas of beauty, how people think about different things, distribution of gender roles, work ethics. This is something that is kind of a hidden under the water. So we need to do a little bit of work in order to actually dive into this ocean and to uncover all these differences. Another way to think about culture is when you imagine an onion. So when you start, culture is like it's like onion with a core that is hidden inside, and then there are outside layers that we try to remove in order to understand what is this culture actually about. So like I said, you have this outer level that is represented by usually visual cues like arts and architecture, and when you start peeling it off little by little, you start uncover specifically cultural patterns of thoughts, beliefs, specific attitudes, social expectations, and so on and so forth. And of course, this is something that you cannot grasp immediately. It comes to you only after living in the culture for some particular amount of time. There is one more way to think about culture is when you imagine yourself being a fish in a tank. So the fish is you, and the water around, or a tank. This is your culture, your home culture, where you're coming from. So usually when we are in this water, we don't question our ways, how we exist. We don't question how we move around. We don't question what this water consists of. But when we are being brought into a different water or into a different tank, that the composition of the water may be a little bit different. There is different elements. There might be different fish coming to play with us or to interact with us. And in this regard, we start to become more self-aware about, first of all, ourselves and how we are different from others. And second of all, what is this water around us look like or feels like? All right, so now I want to give you a few examples about the cultural differences, and that has been taken from the research that we know in the psychology of cross-cultural psychology and cultural psychology between different cultures. And that actually relates to this small c's, the culture that is the iceberg that is actually underneath the water. For example, when it comes to emotional display, how people show or don't show their emotions in everyday life or in the streets, we can look into the comparison between Polish and Irish culture. If you ever travel to Poland, for example, you might have noticed that people usually don't smile in the streets, right? They kind of, have this kind of a serious look, and it gives you the first impression that probably people are not very friendly, right? On the other hand, you have an Irish culture where people, on the contrary, they display their positive emotions very much from the very first encounter, and that gives you an impression that this surrounding or this environment is very friendly, right? So, of course, it doesn't mean that people from Polish culture are not very friendly. But this is kind of this social agreement of not displaying positive emotion to people who we don't know. That is very much different to an Irish culture. Another example would be how people use in space, or something that we call space proximity. Again, a good comparison here would be a comparison between Latin culture and Swiss culture. Let's say in Swiss culture, people are very much protective about their personal space. So even a small touch, with your elbow of a person who is not close to you in any sense, would be considered as something, not very welcoming. On the other hand, when you look into the Latin culture, so people are actually very much around their bodies, and they really don't mind small or close space proximity. And you can actually notice from the very first encounter when, let's say, if you're greeted in the Latin culture, people usually give you a kiss or a hug, right? So it's a very different way of using space. One more example with voice volume. In some cultures, people use their volumes more, let's say, louder than in other cultures. And let's say you, in this regard, you can look into Indian culture or German culture. So in German culture, we know that there is a particular attitude to noise, right? So people in this regard, they using their voice very cautiously and try not to disturb their neighbors. On the other hand, you have an Indian culture where people usually express themselves, express their opinions in a quite loud way, and sometimes, that might also lead to some cultural clashes. One more example about the attitude to time, let's say, and that was also different, and it's actually very important, the attitude to time when you are in a professional surrounding or even in a student surrounding. If you come to a different culture, please make sure that you ask people around, right? What does it mean to be on time? How much is late? Being late is allowed, and things like this, because it's also very different. Let's say I'm based in Ireland at the moment, and here we say that the right time to come is 5 minutes after the initial time. So it means that cultures very much agree, on people being a little bit late, and it's not seen as something inappropriate. That is a very different attitude to in comparison with some other cultures, like, for example, German culture. And one more example that I wanted to point your attention to is a sharing culture. And again, I would like to compare here Indian and German culture. Let's say when it comes to food, right? So let's imagine you go to a restaurant and with a group of friends, and here you can see how sharing culture actually operates. So in the Indian culture, it's very much about food and sharing food, so it doesn't seem as anything inappropriate if you ask for a piece of something from the plate of your neighbor just to try. That is, in German culture, it's a different attitude. So sharing comes mostly with the development, with already development of some close connections between two people. So you wouldn't share your food with someone who you don't know very well. Right, that was been a little bit about culture and what is a big C and a small c. And I do want you to remember about the small c aspect, because if you manage to grasp this is actually a very good ground for you to develop intercultural competencies. So the big C is fine, especially when we go for tourism. We don't get exposed too much to small c. However, when we have to stay for a particular amount of time in a new context, so this is small c, when it becomes important. So we know that our identity, or the way how we feel about themselves, the way how we define ourselves, is very much impacted by our cultural context, where we've been brought up, where we socialized. And in this regard, there is something that we call cultural identity. And based on the definitions of some very prominent researchers, we can now say that cultural identity is a part of person's identity or self-conception that is related to our nationality, ethnicity, religion, social class, generation, or any kind of social group that has its own culture. On the other hand, that refers to one's beliefs regarding their membership in social groups, and it also gives us a sense of identity that arises from a social group membership, right? So when you think about your home culture in this regard, and it can be very different for many of us. Some people will think in terms of their nationality and as they belongingness, let's say saying, I am German or I'm Italian. Other people might relate mostly to their religious affiliation, saying that I'm Jew, for example, regardless and where do I live. Other people mostly see themselves in terms of their ethnicity, for example, and their skin color or their small ethnic group, regardless where they live. And what it means also is that it gives us a particular sense of belongingness, that we belong to this group and we share some similarities. So here you can see that there are actually a lot of cultural groups or cultural identities that an individual combines within itself. It's our nationality, it's our ethnicity, religion, social class, it's our age, it's our gender, and we can go on. It can be depending on what is important for us. It can be sometimes our intellectual attitudes, again depending, I don't know, if you want to go to an Ivy League, for example, so that would be very important. Or sometimes we even talk about educational identity, right? So what institution you graduated from, and things like this. So there are positive and negative outcomes when we talk about our group belongingness. And as we know now, and I'm sure that you all experience that, when we feel ourselves as a member of the group, that gives us a very positive feeling of belonging. So that we belong, and we are respected, we are accepted, we are recognized as members, as an individuals. We can also ask and get support from our group members, and we also have a feeling of understanding, right? So sometimes we don't have to spell everything what we have to say, but our group understands us. The negative elements comes when there is something happening and we get excluded from the group, not necessarily voluntary. Sometimes even when we move to a different culture, so you're kind of very much distant from members of your own group. So you find yourself in the group that you don't feel you belong. And that might lead to some feelings like being isolated, being depressed. Depending on how this new group sees you, you might get feelings of being ashamed of who you are or where you're coming from. You might feel that you don't belong, or you're not valued as a human being, and so on and so forth. And that actually speaks about how powerful actually our social belonging is and how much we are social beings. On the other hand, when we talk about our social part of identity, we should not forget about what we also call personal identity, because after all, as you can see here on the picture, right, so after all, every individual is very much different, even if we belong in the same group. So our personal identity is a unique combination of personal values, our goals, attitudes, behavioral styles, life expectancies, characteristics, everything that comprises an individual. So you are referring to your personal identity when you talk about yourself, when you say, I'm a friendly person, I'm a kind person, I like to go out and things like this. So you express your preferences, your goals, who you are. And what we also must not forget that personal and cultural identities, they are actually two components that are not actually so much different from each other of an individual, of who I am. So even when we change context, when we move from culture to culture, our identity, our cultural identity might also change. Let's say if you decide to settle in a different culture, you might develop your other cultural identity. You might say, okay, now I'm going to become American, but I'm still being someone who is, let's say, Italian, right? So your cultural identity is changing, but all of that, it's still a very much component of your personal identity that is very much expressed in your individual attitudes, behaviors, what you like, what you don't like, and so on and so forth. Now I want you to walk through something that we call social categorization. And this is very much important to understand why intercultural competencies are actually necessary when we move to a different culture. So social categorization, this is a theory that we have in social psychology, and it's usually referred to as an automatic process of classifying people into categories. So for each category group or group, we have a prototype that represents feelings, attitudes, and behavior of a typical individual of that group. Now, let's now unpack this definition. And so what does it mean is that the way how our brain work when we talk about social environment and people around us, or when we talk about objects and environment, we have a tendency to categorize things, objects, and people in different groups. So, and it's very true for everything that we encounter. Let's say when you enter a new room, so you categorize this, okay, this is a lecture room, right? Because of how it's set up, the attributes and then you enter to a different room and you understand, right, this is a bedroom, right? So you categorize the environment around you into different groups, and depending on how you categorize this, you know what is expected from you to do that. So if you understand that this is a lectures room or lecturing room, so this is where you teach, or where you learn, or where you do some activities related to your studies. If it's a bedroom or it's a living room, so that implies different activity, right? When it comes to a prototype, it means that every category, or in our minds, within every category, we have some kind of a prototype. And at this moment, to illustrate that, imagine that somebody asks you to think about a bird. So without any other instructions, just close your eyes and think about a bird, right? And then when I ask you to tell me what kind of bird did you imagine? And people can give very different answers. Some people can say, well, I was thinking about a sparrow. And the other might say, well, a bird for me is, let's say, an eagle or a swan or something else, right? So this is your prototype of a bird, and it's very much developed based on the environment where you used to live. So if you see mostly sparrows, that usually creates a prototype of a bird for you. But of course, this is true for but of course, it is true only for this environment. So when you move, let's say, closer to the sea, so then you see more swans, and your prototype gets enriched with and gets changed a little bit with the different knowledge. So the same implies when we talk about people. So let's say we're walking down the street and someone is just approaching you and ask for directions. So you turn your head and you look at the person, and the process of categorization immediately starts. So you identify the gender of a person, age, language, maybe, I don't know, dressing habits and things like this. And depending on what you identify, you might even change your way of talking to a person. Let's say if it's an elderly woman, so you might start talking a bit slower, might be offering some help. If it's a young woman that is, or a young girl that's like you, right, you might use a little bit of a slang in your language, because you know that this is kind of the language expectations also depend on in what group you are. So what are the outcomes of the social categorization? One of the outcomes, something that we call an outgroup homogeneity effect, and that means that within our own group, let's say if you're an Italian, so within your own group of an Italian, you see that other Italians are actually much more similar to you than people from a different culture. So let's say if you're Italian coming to Germany, right, you might think, oh, we Italians, we are like that, right? But Germans are very much different. So our brain kind of artificially increase the distance with a group that is different from us. Another mechanism that comes from the social categorization, this is so-called social comparison. And we know that this is a universal mechanism, and we always compare ourselves to different people, but it's become very much prominent when we find ourselves in a different environment, because this is where we start noticing how much we are actually different from other people again. And depending how we react to this feeling of differences, we sometimes might feel uncomfortable, we might feel that we don't belong, We might feel that we don't fit. We might feel anxious, and sometimes the fear or the anxiety become, so high that it drives us to find comfort in our own groups. Let's say if I'm Italian, so I feel more comfortable with my Italian friends than with the German group, let's say, right? Um, and one more mechanism, this is something that is called in-group and out-group distinction, and this is a psychological identification as a member within a group. So by contrast then, the out-group is usually perceived different. And that is actually a matter to understand when we move into the area of stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination, right? So because we know now that the way how our brain wired and the way how our psychology actually works. So we tried to stick to groups and people that are similar to us, and we have this artificial mechanism of increasing of this psychological distance with people who look different or are coming from a different place, and that creates a particular tendency or particular, let's say, process of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. Let's look into this a little bit. So here I want you to understand very much the difference between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, because sometimes it gets mixed up, and sometimes we tend to um, we tend to um, think sometimes that stereotype is equal to discrimination, that if we see people in a particular way or if we put stereotype of them, we automatically discriminate them. However, that's actually not the case. And as we've now seen, that stereotyping or categorization, that is very much the same mechanism, is very much how our brain works in order to simplify the environment. And especially if you don't have any new information coming in. Let's say if you've never been to Germany and you only heard about from other people what Germans are, so you create this kind of a stereotype of a German person, right? But it's not yet prejudice and it's not yet discrimination. This is kind of a prototype that is just based on your belief and, kind of representation. So when does it become a prejudice? Stereotypes become a prejudice when we attach an emotional component to them, whether this is a positive component or a negative component. So let's say when you say, and this component plus we also see this group as, very much different and sometimes in a hierarchical status. Let's say you say Italians allowed, right? That is kind of this negative component we attach to stereotypes because we know that they're using their voice a little bit higher than Germans. We can then evaluate it in a negative sense, saying that, it's not good to be so loud in public. This is where prejudice comes in. And eventually, discrimination part comes in when our behavior becomes to be driven by our prejudice. So let's say you're having a party and then you say, well, I'm not going to invite these Italian friends because, it's going to be very loud and neighbors is going to complain after that. So this is where you actually start discriminating your Italian friends based on prejudice that are attached to stereotypes, right? This is a very important component also for understanding and for uncovering and for dismantling behaviors that might look like discriminatory behavior, and also for you to understand, where all this is coming from. So what mechanism do we have to combat prejudice and to combat discrimination? One of the very general and good mechanisms that we have so far, this is something what we call an intergroup contact. And this is when we go to a different culture or go to a different country and increase our encounters of our interactions with members from various groups. The good point, if this interaction is actually positive for us, because again, if this interaction is negative, this is going to only enforce our prejudice and discrimination. So we try to strive for positive interaction and communication that can be very much enhanced by openness, by trying to reach some mutual understanding, by sharing, and so on and so forth. Second of all, we know that only interacting with people from different cultural background is not enough to break down prejudice and create some more inclusive environment. What is also important is to have this exposure to different cultures and people from different environments as much as possible. So it's not only that you once in your life talk to someone or you have friends of a different group. What is more important is to actually continue to practice this in order to develop your intercultural competencies. So nature of the contact, whether it's positive or negative, and frequency of this contact, the more frequent the better, is very much important, so that this intergroup contact actually leads to enriching your stereotypes about people from a different culture, to combat prejudice, and to avoid any discriminatory behavior. So when we find ourselves in a different culture, in the intergroup contact, when we start talking and interacting with people who are different from us, we have an opportunity, a good opportunity to develop a cultural sensitivity. And here I want to refer you to a cultural sensitivity theory that was again developed by a very prominent researcher in this area, Milton Bennett, and that is called Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity. So what this model does, it describes persons' attitudes to cultural differences in a kind of in the way of a process. But what we need to remember is that this process is not linear. So what you can see here on the screen now, this is the full components, the full process of model of intercultural sensitivity development. And you can see now that there are 6 different stages from denial to integration, and those 6 stages are actually divided into 2 parts. The left 3 stages are called ethnocentrism or ethnocentrism, polar or focus, and the other 3 stages are called ethnorelatism. So when we try to be more culturally aware, when we are on the way to develop intercultural competencies, we are actually moving from the denial part, from the left part of the ethnocentrism scale to the right part. That's something that we call ethnorelativism. And this development can take quite some time. So it's not happening immediately. It's not even a few months. It can go over a few years even. And depends on the personality, depends on the quality of your contact, the frequency, the exposure, and many, many other characteristics. And sometimes we can even come back to the previous stage and, kind of regress a little bit and then move forward. So there is no harm in doing this at all. This is a very much process that is kind of going on in time, right? So the stage of denial, what does it mean is that, let's say again, I'm coming from Italian culture, right? And I'm now in Germany doing my studies. So if I'm on the denial stage, so I'm very much ingrained in my Italian culture, and I'm failing to perceive the existence of a relevance of a German culture. So I might say, yeah, our Italian culture is so rich, and we have this and we have that, and German culture, yeah, but no, our Italian culture is much nicer, right? This is a denial stage. Then if a person continues with intergroup contact, self-awareness and, openness and trying to acquire some knowledge about the German culture, then the person might move to the stage of a defense. So in this regard, a person starts to notice in specific cultural groups and starts to evaluate those groups in a kind of polarized ways. So you can, the difference with denial now is that now we acknowledge the existence of this culture, but we see mostly differences, right? We say, well, we Italians, we are like this, and Germans are like that, or French people are like that. Right, so there is still no communication between cultures is actually happening. Then when we move to the 3rd stage, and this is the stage of minimization, then when a person is rather trying to look into the common shared human experience between two cultures, and at the same time overlooking cultural differences. So what it means is that we might look into the Italian and German culture and say, well, but we are all looking for love, we all want to be friends, and this is what unites us. But it's all good. But the negative part of that we're still avoiding acknowledgement of cultural differences, because again, making friends in Italy and Germany can be very different processes, and we fail to acknowledge that we need to, if you want to make friends with German or with French people, let's say, then we have to develop some new ways of doing it. Then we move to the right part of ethno-relativism, when we're kind of coming out of this shelf of our own cultural perspective and try to acquire and develop some new ways that are more appropriate to the culture where we are currently in. So the first stage of ethno-relativism is acceptance. So, and in this regard, we're mostly talking about attributing equal human complexity to different groups, right? So we're finally seeing new culture, whether it's German culture or French culture, that this culture is as complex as our Italian culture, right? Although it might not seem the same like that from the very first look. The next stage of ethno-relativism would be an adaptation. So in that regard, we start to develop some new ways of behaviors and thinking and acting reactions that are more appropriate to a German or French culture, depending where we are, right? So we have our Italian ways of doing things, and now we're developing new ways. And the final stage is an integration stage that is seen there here as the top of the ethno-relativism. And that usually refers to when a person becomes competent in both cultures, right? So a person acts as Italian in Italian culture and acts as German in German culture. And here is just a little bit of a different way of looking at the same model of cultural sensitivity, right? So you can see, so we're kind of moving from a monocultural mindset to a more intercultural mindset, and from denial when we miss differences, when we judge differences, when we de-emphasize differences, to a more complex and comprehensive way of understanding a different culture in order to bridge these differences in our own personality. So what is this intercultural competence then? And here I want to refer you to a definition that is done by Darla Derdorf. She's a very important researcher in the whole area of intercultural competencies, and we will work with some of her suggestions on exercises through the workshops. But here what I want you to remember, that cultural competencies is competencies for effective and appropriate communication. And I want to stress these two components here. It's effective and appropriate. So that means that, first of all, our communication in a different culture is appropriate to the context, right? It's appropriate to different people that we communicate in. So that would mean that we know how to behave in a different country, in a different settings. We know what is expected from us when we go to a bar in a different culture. We know what is expected from us when we talk to a lecturer in a different country. We know what is expected when we going through some legal processes, how to behave in a very formal environment, an informal environment. And second component, that our communication needs to be effective. So when we have a goal, and we always have a goal when we communicate or interact in an environment, so we need to be able to reach this goal, right? So our behavior needs to be appropriate to the context, and it needs to be effective so that our goals in a new context actually fulfilled. And here we have three components of intercultural competencies, and this is our attitudes, our knowledge, and our skills. So when we talk about attitudes, and you can just read it on the screen. So first of all, that means that when we're in a different cultural environment, we need to be able to develop a particular level of respect of a different culture. And here we need to actually understand some difference between acceptance and respect that we sometimes also get confused. Of course, not every cultural practice can be accepted by any other individuals because cultures are just so different, and some practices might, even come in conflict with each other. Like you cannot be religious and a-religious at the same time, right? So you have to have a particular level of respect, even if you do not fully accept some specific values or customs or so on and so forth. Second of all, what is important is openness to experience, curiosity, and discovery. And this is actually something that will drive your better understanding of a different cultures, that will drive your curiosity, will motivate you to ask questions about things and traditions that you don't know. Second element relates to specific knowledge that we acquire about cultures that we're in, and also about ourselves. So because we are in a different culture, we start unpacking as well, not only that culture, but also our own personality and our own cultural impact. So when we see how things are done in a different culture, it makes us reflect on how things are done in my culture, and it makes us also think why things are done in this culture. So we kind of start unpacking this onion of our own culture little by little as well. And that gives us understanding not only of the cultures that we're exposed to, but also of our own culture where we are coming from. The third important component is skills, especially just skills and behavior that we exhibit in the everyday life. So it's not only attitude, how we relate to people, it's not only knowledge about other people and ourselves, but it's also skills, what we practice. And in this regard, we know that some really basic skills, basic in terms for psychology and for human interaction, they are extremely important for intercultural competencies. For example, observation. So we need to be very attentive to small differences or details in the new environment where we're in. Listening. So it's not something that we say call in psychology active listening, right? So when you're not just listen to in order to respond, but you listen to understand. Then another way is evaluating, analyzing, interpreting, and relating. Relating in terms that you try to understand how this new experience relates to you. And in terms of outcomes, so what we're interested in, again, to become interculturally competent, you need to eventually develop effective and appropriate behavior, and that will be based on the flexibility and adaptability. And this flexibility and adaptability, this is the outcome that you get after working through your attitudes, knowledge, and skills that are elements of intercultural competence. And finally, I want you to have a look at some elements of building cultural sensitivity and building resilience in the cultural space. Some of them are very similar to what we have just in the previous slide, but what I want you to pay specific attention to is tolerance to ambiguity. So this is what we know is extremely important in the intercultural context, and it will also save a lot of stress exposures to you. So tolerance to ambiguity means that a specific skill that individual can develop when we do not get stressed out in the environment that we don't fully understand, or the environment that might have different interpretations, right? Because in our own culture, there is kind of always the assumption there is one right way to do things, but in a different environment, that might not be the case. So when you find yourself in a situation that you think, well, maybe this is that, or maybe this is different, right? So do not try to look immediately for the right answer. Try to explore both sides in order to, again, develop your knowledge. Maybe talk to other people, and be present and be calm, because that will also help you to stay open to a new information that is coming in, and to become more resilient to more situations that are like that. Another important component is withholding judgment, and this is again because we react quite often in the environment that we already know as a cultural environment. We kind of make assumptions very easily. We say, "Oh, this is like that, right?" Or "I know how to do this," right? So we judge immediately without questioning much. So usually these strategies doesn't work in a new cultural environment. So when you try to understand something, stay for a moment and keep a pause, like press a pause, and before you come to a judgment how to evaluate the situation, just wait for a little bit, look at how situation unfolds before you make a final conclusion about that. Another important component, just want to let you know that asking clarifying questions and bring in the situation as more self-clarity as you can. Again, because cultures operate from different assumptions, in order to avoid any cultural clashes and misunderstandings with people who you're interacting with, you need to be very much clear about what you say. Sometimes put different words into this, come out with different examples, because again, how we talk and what we say operates from our own culture. In a different culture that might need a little bit of more effort in order to be understood, right? And of course, ask clarifying questions. Quite often, even if we know, and you probably came across to such situations, even if you know that you understood everything, but then the situation unfolds in the way that actually you were not correct about your assumptions. So always ask questions, even if situation looks very familiar or very simple to you. And that will keep you open, and that will keep you curious and open to development of intercultural competences. All right, so this is all for today.